My first question is, what are the trends that have shaped cyber defense today and are going to continue to shape it in the future?
So, I could talk about TTPs, I could talk about different technology and different threats, but I would actually, rather than the trends, in a very political way, not answer your direct question, but what I would like to do is say there is one constant, and the constant is that there is a beating heart behind every single cyber attack. In other words, there's a perpetrator, an attacker, a beating heart behind that. They're using bits and bytes to exploit, but there is a beating heart. And so really need to understand what the motivations of that individual are. Often the target, 70% of the attacks in my organization are through an individual, are through one of our colleagues. So understanding how we can help and support that individual to be part of the security environment, massively important. One of the things that really upsets me when I listen to calls like this is the phrase from Csos and others is, our people are our weakest link. Well, if they are our weakest link, who's at fault? I am, because I haven't trained them in such a way to be part of the overall piece. And there is another area, another group of people who are often neglected, and that's our teams. And how do we ensure that we retain and develop great people? So, Brad, I have not answered your question, and I've not answered it in purpose, because to me, whilst there are trends, they'll shift and change. But to my mind, identifying that people are behind the attacks, are the target of the attacks, and will deal with the attacks is probably the most important factor.
And you mentioned kind of recruiting and retaining good people. And I know kind of Karla's got some good background in the people space. Have you got anything else to kind of tag on there, Karla?
Doing the classic, can't unmute myself. So, I mean, yes, so much about how you recruit and retain more people. I think one thing that's really interesting this year is how people were treated in 2020. Did companies treat people well during the pandemic? Have you focused on their well-being? I think that's going to be a real differentiator for people that are trying to hire. And actually that hybrid work model, are you going to force people into the office? If you're saying we're in the office 2 days a week, so isn't that great, we're flexible. Well, flexibility is about employees having a choice, not about a different work pattern. So I think there's going to be some really interesting things that come out for how we do that going forwards.
Cool, thanks. And kind of the next question, probably to you, Karla, particularly from a third-party risk perspective, and then Dave, I'll just come over to you from a technical understanding. So obviously, there's been some really big incidents in the last year. One of them, obviously, is the SolarWinds breach. Now, particularly from a third-party risk perspective, Karla, kind of how has that changed cyber defense, the SolarWinds breach in particular?
I think that breach, coupled with some updated advice from the financial regulators, has created a bit of a perfect storm for a focus on third-party security. It's really highlighted, I think that's probably one of the biggest ones that have highlighted that third-party security is an issue. Although I think anyone that's in security has known that for some time and has known there needs to be a focus on it. But now we've probably got the attention of our boards and the people that actually need to kind of spend money to help us get that mitigation in place. And I was a little concerned at the beginning, this was a very sophisticated attack. Does that mean that boards ignore it? Because actually it's so sophisticated, and we all as an industry say how we can't protect against those things, can't protect against everything. But I don't think that's come through. But I think it is important to remind them that actually a lot of attacks aren't that. A lot of attacks are from commercial ransomware groups or other bad actors. So just because that was a sophisticated nation state attack doesn't mean that the other risks are any less.
And obviously nation state attacks, they're really good at what they do, aren't they? So Dave, any other comments about the technical or the business side and what's changed in regards to that?
Yeah, it's an interesting discussion because I think coming back to Malcolm's point and Karla's point, why is people so important? I think part of the reason why people are more important than they ever have been is because I think the trends that is pushing things along in the attacker's advantage is the fact, in terms of both knowledge, in terms of tools, and in terms of skills, they are advancing at an ever rapid pace. And I think SolarWinds is a good example of just like very good hacking, basically. You know what I mean? That where a lot of lessons were learned from previous operations and sort of applied together in really quite a catastrophic result. So I think, you know, if we're talking about trends, I think the advancement of the threat is something that we've really, really got to consider. But also remembering in the context of history, you know, like SolarWinds is not the first supply chain attack we've seen. You know, the NotPetya attack was accounting-based software. Havex back in 2013 was, you know, hacking websites of like, you know, ICS or industrial control system manufacturers. So we've seen this time and time again, but we've got a habit of quickly forgetting as well.
Sure, and Dave, obviously APT groups are obviously going to, you know, they're moving at a phenomenal rate, but organized criminal groups have moved on quite significantly as well. I think particularly during the pandemic, I saw a change in some of ransomware behavior. Is there anything you can talk about, kind of changes of ransomware behavior and how they're evolving?
Yeah, I mean, like any good businesses, they always look at their business model and see how they can make it more profitable. I think 2020, the ransomware groups did a great pivot into slightly changing their tactics, and so not unsurprisingly, they found out if we can steal your data in the first instance, all of a sudden the propensity for businesses to pay becomes a lot more compelling. So that pivot was very, very interesting, and of course it has a number of so whats for security. But again, like coming back to the trends, so we mentioned advancement of the threat. I think three more trends, I think, all have sort of accumulated into the success of ransomware groups. So complexity, the sheer amount of data, and the fact that you can make loads of money out of hacking now, you know, like, so like this is all coming together because people can make loads of money. You know, it's not like we're stealing credit card information and selling it for maybe like, you know, £1 per pop on an underground forum, if not much less. It's like, you know, we've seen some humongous ransomware claims, and what that does is it attracts talent, right? You know, if you're getting well paid, it attracts and it fuels the talent on the attacker side to do better and better, because all of a sudden there's no bounds to what they can do. So so I'll leave that point there hanging for the other panelists for now.
And Malcolm, obviously, kind of, if there's an increased risk and there's kind of monetary loss and there's business impact, kind of from your CISO perspective in terms of securing investment and changing your technology, is there anything you could talk about how you or your peers have kind of responded to that change in behavior?
Yes, so let's realize that there has been a shift. And the shift is from the concept that, you know, you're going to be hit by multiple attempts of ransomware, sort of the trawl effect. So regardless of whether it's an APT or it's a criminal organization, they're going to spend more time in your space, in your environment, in order that they can both embed themselves and traverse as they've done traditionally, but also to identify that juicy bit of information that is going to embarrass you. Does it embarrass you to do one thing, and that is engage them with the payment of the ransom? I love the concept of, you know, ransomware as a business model. So just protecting against ransomware now is no longer just the solution. It is, how do you communicate to your customers, to your stakeholders, to your shareholders, that actually you've got the ability to manage not just a ransomware event, but a data loss event as well. And I think that, to me, is the most significant piece. But I also see that this is an opportunity. Now, let's avoid the discussions with the decision makers, with the board, around fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It's about the fact that this is a real threat, that our customers and our clients are concerned about that threat. And so rather than saying the sky is going to fall in, how do we use the investment as proof of our ability to better manage operations, data for our clients? So turn the dialogue from fear to actually, we can use it as a way of winning, retaining clients by differentiating ourselves, by proving our robustness to this, you know, pervasive threat that we see.
Sure, and clearly adversaries are getting more advanced, as kind of explained. The business is changing all the time, and technologies are always changing. Like we're just in a state of massive change all the time. People are changing. So particularly one of the kind of trends since the pandemic has been the public cloud and the migration of the public cloud. So kind of coming to you, Karla. Obviously, you've got a real kind of experience in this risk space and the people space, and how can organizations which are moving towards the public cloud more and more and more, particularly because of the pandemic, there's been a less of a dependence on their corporate estates. How can they use these changes to kind of pivot and better use new technology to protect their organizations?
Yeah, I think there's so much in that, especially if you go back to some in office and then some, hybrid environment where you're going to need maybe a mix of those solutions, or you might have to be rethinking what you're doing for the long term. But I see two real issues, and I know there's many more, but I think one of the issues is where you're using those cloud providers, they're key suppliers to you, but they typically don't want to tell you the things that you might normally ask a supplier on your risk assessment. It's going to be really difficult to get that information out of them. If you're Microsoft, you're not giving that information. It's, use us or don't. So I think companies have got a real challenge there. And there's sometimes, I think, for smaller organizations, an expectation that security is built in. And I think there needs to be some awareness that they push that responsibility back to you to configure that properly. And then the people aspect is another really big one. There simply aren't enough cloud security professionals because it's so new, and there's not enough people to meet the demand. So that is definitely a real challenge that I've seen for organizations, getting the people with the right knowledge.
Thanks, Karla. And obviously other things that are changing are kind of regulations always changing. We're seeing different cybersecurity regulations in different countries. There's a whole bunch of different standards. Malcolm, particularly because you've got experience of kind of IT and OT environments, and you've got significant experience in critical national infrastructure, kind of regulatory changes can be quite challenging. And how do you deal with them in the cloud? Do you have to deal with them? How do you manage them across your business? Because it's a mix of business and it's a big mix of technical, and everything's changing.
Well, so I think once again, it's the relationship that you generate and develop with the business and with other actors in the organization. And so, one of my strongest relationships is with the data privacy officer. So understanding the requirements, understanding the range of solutions that we can invest in, people, process, technology, massively important. And I think, again, coming back to this dialogue around the opportunity. So the opportunity is, of course, to say we've got to get to the gold standard of the regulation. But if that blows the business case of why we're doing something out of the water, then we will most definitely be seen as the business prevention, business interruption team. So to me, first of all, it's about relationships. And secondly, it is the dialogue around, if we become compliant with NIST-D, it enables us to engage with clients who want us to consult and manage projects within the critical national infrastructure. If we have an understanding of how we pass data around the globe, and we can actually, once again, prove that we can do that, then it's how do we translate that into the business value? So to smash the regulation, we've got to do it or we're all going to jail approach is going to fail. Showing how good management of our cybersecurity enables us to become regulatory compliant, to then use that as a way of going to the business and for them to go to the clients is absolutely the right approach. To my mind, it's an opportunity for us to justify the value that security provides. From my perspective, the relationships massively important. You talk about the cloud. It's how do you shift security discussions left in the project, not just in the development of applications, but the development of cloud solutions. And I think that to me is the important part of relationships. How do you generate them so the other actors are willing to bring you on board to engage with, as Karla said, to ensure that security is designed into the solution.
I think there's a really interesting vein there in terms of the value of security programs and how do you measure them and kind of get get business buy-in based upon security value. Karla or Dave, have you got any kind of comments of the best ways and how you would approach assessing value, or any other points? Because that's super valuable.
I would just say something, just from personal experience, Brad, sometimes we sit in front of security teams and they're instantly surprised when we say, hey, we're going to insist on actually testing this in your environment. And we're vendors, right? And so for us then, when we say we're going to test this in your environment to actually make sure that what we all think and hope that it actually does in your environment specifically, I think that's the first thing. And I think, a continuous sort of program of testing, not just so that you're eyes wide open with your detection effectiveness and your efficiency, but also make sure that it's instrumented correctly as well with the other dependencies that it relies on. And then I think there's just some great initiatives out there, such as the MITRE ATT&CK framework that has began to lower the barrier to entry of knowledge and visibility across the board in terms of like mitigation against technical risk. And I know we use that quite heavily, but I find that's a really useful sort of focal point to center everyone around, to make them, because we'd all love to be able to click our fingers and boom, like we got a great security program, instantly implementable in front of us. And so we've got to make some hard choices, I guess, as security leaders. And so being able to use that as a framework to enable those hard choices is something that we find helpful as well.
Sure, and Karla, critically, I think Dave's obviously talking about kind of detection effectiveness and the MITRE ATT&CK framework, kind of how it's used. I think what we haven't quite gone for is kind of how do we align that to business value? How when you're selling a security program, like how do you, everyone knows about annualized loss estimation and the old kind of, it's classic CIS stuff, so we won't go into it now, but kind of how's that evolved? Because I'm sure it's come a long way from kind of figuring out the rate of occurrence and reducing that.
Yeah, I've seen a real change over the time I've been in the industry. And I think what's much more accepted is that security leaders need to be business leaders as well, and need that business leadership experience. And I've seen more and more either CISOs or people who want to be CISOs working closer with finance teams. I see more CISOs who report to CFOs now, or who have maybe gone to them as mentors or have close relationships with them, because CFOs have really good experience at taking these sort of things that are maybe a business cost and justifying that return. So actually I think it's about working a bit like Malcolm said, build your relationships and work with other teams and other departments to help you communicate that.
So Brad, just jumping in there, because I think Karla's hit the nail on the head. It's turning the discussion with the business away from we're an insurance policy, away from break glass in case of emergency, to actually your clients are demanding this, and this comes back to the opportunity that regulatory demand, that the fact that you turn every page on a newspaper and see some form of cyber attack, and you look at the number of RFPs that have got security embedded in the questionnaire, and then the number of audits that we then have to follow through, and it's measuring those that actually really points to we were involved in the winning and retaining of clients. And to me, that measurement is massively important. Is it going to be the reason why Wood wins business? Well, do you know, in some of the regulated business, DFARS in the US, some of the engagements with the MOD, absolutely it is. Is it going to be a reason why we retain clients? 100%. If we've got it wrong, that client is going to be less confident to trust our statements. So to me, the creation of a client and supplier security team is absolutely valuable here. Client, how can we prove that we're doing what we say we're doing on behalf of the clients? Supplier, to Karla's point about third-party analysis, that's the soft underbelly. The soft underbelly into my organization. And when you look at linking the two, in turn, am I the soft underbelly into our client? And if I am, then how is that going to be exploited? And if it is going to be exploited, what is the friction that I'm going to put in place to reduce the ability to achieve that, or to reduce the amount of time it takes in order that I can get something in place to prevent that exploitation. So to me, client and supplier security teams is the next move in security.
Really insightful there. Thanks. And just on Karla's point earlier, she mentioned about she's seen an emerging trend of CISOs reporting to CFOs. Now, there's obviously an enormous debate on where CISOs should report to. Do you think CISOs would be more effective if they were reporting to CFOs?
So the last two organizations, so FTSE 100 companies, Fortune 100 companies, I've reported into the CFO. Now, there's benefits and there's negatives. The benefit is to Karla's point, you're being coached by probably the right hand of the CEO as to how to generate a business case. And the influence that the CFO in turn has is obviously extraordinary. The downside is that you do become, it's dangerous that you may well become the cobbler's children. Now, as the salami slices are cut, easier to cut closer to home. And so, there's a danger, and that you've got to manage around. So that comes back to how do you articulate the risk? Is it fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or is it back to we can generate client engagement through this? There is no doubt that there are other reporting lines. I think it's interesting, and Karla may have a view as to the number of CISOs who are now reporting directly into the executive committee, and/or are like audit actually reporting into the board. That I think is again the next step, where we see executive committees and boards really understanding where cyber risk sits alongside other risks.
Really interesting. Thanks. And now we've talked about kind of the changing reporting lines. We've talked about kind of the changing architectures. Dave, coming over to you now. Obviously, threats we've talked about evolving till now. Where are the threats? Where do you think that they're going to go in the next 12 months and beyond?
Yes, it's always interesting to take a threat-centric view in isolation. I don't think sometimes even it's not that helpful, as in they'll be going where you least likely suspect them to go. I mean, that's their job, and that's what they're very good at doing. I think, to collect in together some of Malcolm and Karla's points before, it's about people, it's about process, and of course, like technology. I guess like we should talk about a little bit about more this double-edged sword of the public cloud, especially, it's where everyone's going. Like Brad, probably every single day we sit in front of people and they're telling us about their, not just going to like single public cloud, but like multi-public cloud, some of that being driven by additional compliance requirements, and I think what we're beginning to see is, if we look back to the SolarWinds attack, and maybe this is an indication of the future, is just how adept that these threats are at understanding the administrative back end of those public cloud environments even better than we do ourselves, which of course is, like I say, exactly where you would expect them to be going. And so I think, to actually answer your question, I think that's probably, we've held out quite a few companies now, with this exact same problem. And so we're going to see more of it as people are beginning to go all in on the cloud.
So you've actually talked about kind of the changing organization versus what attackers are going to evolve to. And we've seen attackers evolve a lot. Anything else about what attackers are likely to do in the future, do you think? You would have a stab for a 2021, 2022 bet?
Yeah, I think it's just going to be more of the same. I think you're just going to continually see the bar go higher and higher. Like if I was to think what I'd be thinking of if I was an attacker, I'd be thinking, how can we just leverage the complexity of the modern environment? I'd be thinking, how can we you've seen the transition of using command and control in the continental United States within SolarWinds. That makes a lot of sense post Snowden, because we know that the NSA can't internally monitor that, so just much better tradecraft, much more, living off the land, and much more impacting or focusing on leveraging the complexity of the modern enterprise against those that use it.
Yeah.
Just to jump in there, I completely agree, and I think if there's one word that gives me the greatest concern, it's speed. The speed that the attacker will move at. Yes, there may be quite a lot of dwell time, that we have an opportunity to use the MITRE ATT&CK to identify and reconnaissance and the like, but the speed of exploitation is going to improve drastically, improve drastically in terms of the attacker. And so therefore we have got to enable within security almost a two-speed security model. One is that let's make sure that we've got the appropriate knowledge and understanding of our environment, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. Let's understand where the vulnerabilities are. Let's make sure that we patch appropriately. Let's make sure that we train appropriately. And that's, if you like, that slow, repeatable wheel. And then we've got to ensure that we've got this very rapid process to enable us to identify the threat rapidly and then respond as quickly as our attackers. And I think if there was any area that we generally as not just an organization, but as an industry, it's that speed of response. You look at the layers of decision making that you've got to drive through, from the SOC analyst who's got the best information at hand, who then in turn has got to potentially go through the business information security officer, the CISO, the CFO, the CEO, to isolate a country, a business line. And by the time that all the ticks have been achieved, the attacker will have been in, out, and the impact will be made. So speed, or ability to generate that second speed, that faster speed, is absolutely what I think is the key.
And sorry, just a couple of interesting anecdotes on Malcolm's point there, Brad, and to your general theme of this bit of the question, which I think is interesting. There was an interesting anecdote from one of the incident response companies that maybe the audience would find useful in light of the SolarWinds, which was, the reason why they knew it was the exact same threat actor who they had kicked out once, twice, and this was the third time, is because as soon as they got in, they were able just to run PowerShell commands to target the exact same inboxes of the people they had targeted before. But the reason why they knew it was the exact same threat actor, because the date timestamp of the emails only that they gathered was from the exact same time where they were kicked out the last time, and so like I think this talks to Malcolm's point about speed, and I think it talks to also the 4 unstoppable trends that we described at the start with regard to the advancement of the threat, the complexity, the sheer amount of data in the Bitcoin blockchain. Well, this particular lesson from these attackers, I think, are applicable to both attack and defense, because they're only going after the specific data that they need. And sometimes I think some of the work that we do with defenders, 2 main things I think that we do is simplify when it comes to the complexity. And then it's also about a lot of education around, as defenders, what data, what is the data that we need to focus on to defend our businesses appropriately, because we're just in an age now where we can't collect everything, and so I think those 2 are interesting topics around, because it's only by doing that will we achieve the speed that I think Malcolm's alluding to.
Cool, and thanks. Just to kind of pivot the discussion slightly. Karla, probably coming to you in a moment, but I know there's been a lot of discussion about the cybersecurity skills gap, and some people kind of arguing that it's not a real thing, some people arguing they are, some people identifying that it's particular levels or particular skills. What do you make of it, and how do you think the next 12 months, where are those issues in terms of people, and how are we going to solve them?
Yeah, I mean, it is definitely a thing. It maybe isn't a thing at the entry level, where you do see a lot of people who want to get into the industry, and that is maybe a future challenge that the industry has been pretty quick to address, some of the skills gap challenges. So I can see in a couple of years we won't have that problem at the entry level, but it is definitely a thing when you get to specialist roles. So I would say incident response, cloud security, application security, those real specialist roles are where you see a problem. CISOs are quite interesting because there's probably a lot of them, but when you want someone that has the right business skills or the right company experience, that's maybe more of an issue. I also don't think we see a lot around companies just want this big wish list for not enough money. I think that is only an issue in very immature organizations. Mature companies with qualified, experienced people don't make those mistakes. But I think the big solution is to look at groups of people that have relevant skills and that can upskill in cyber very quickly. So you might see people who are coming from project management or risk management who understand the issues and maybe just need to upskill in some of the technical aspects and can do that pretty quickly. And that's where I think we solve the problem.
Cool. Really interesting things. And kind of Malcolm, in terms of that gap and kind of what's going on to address it, as you look to design security solutions in the future within your organization, is that something you factor in, or how are you going to adjust with that changing landscape? A lot of users, more users working from home, multi-cloud. How are you going to design a security architecture in 2021, 2022?
Yeah, so from a people perspective, I think Karla's hit the nail on the head. There's a dilemma that we have around maintaining specialist skills, and if you think about the sort of the 9-box talent, potential, performance, top left box is really smashing it out of the box, and they're in the right role and they're doing the right thing. And what we need to do is train and educate and continue to generate their technical skills to battle against the bad actor, to maintain that level of technical skill, to stay as close as possible. The other side around the potential piece is, again, to Karla's point, around the idea of how do you ensure that you are giving the opportunity to the potential CISO of the future to engage with the business, to engage with decision makers, to ensure that when they stand in front of an audit committee or the executive committee, they're not going to be giving the technical solutions. They're going to give to an earlier point the idea of accessible information. So I think there's a whole point about development that we need to do a better job of. I do think we need to look at a more diverse portfolio of skills, and then I think the other piece around that, and Karla, you absolutely are right. This idea of an entry-level information security role essentially being need to find to be able to solve world hunger, as well as having an opinion on the Middle East conflict, as well as being a security expert. We just ask for too much, and we don't develop enough from a start point. From a framework perspective, I think it comes back to me for this 2-speed security, and it's something that I'm developing within our organization. How do we ensure that we've got the standard, repeatable parts of the framework in place, from protection through to vulnerability management, through to remediation and the like, and then this second speed of how do we ensure right the way across the organization that we're agile enough? And that's process. It's not actually technology, it's process. How do we utilize the data that comes from our technology to decide more quickly? I'm not going to go into the OODA loop now, but how on earth do we make decisions more rapidly in order to outfox, outbeat the decision making of the attacker?
Thanks, Malcolm. I've always known OODA as observe, overreact, decimate, and apologize. So I'm not sure how it's applied within your organization. One final question from Zaf is he's asking a question about kind of about AI, and I don't like to kind of really talk about AI because AI is not solving a business problem. Dave, just finally, could you kind of give an introduction to briefly why AI might not be the answer, and why actually the one machine learning and different types of approach them? And he asked specifically how it can detect new threats and deal with black swan events.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. Thanks, Zaf, for throwing us that one over the wall. Appreciate it. Okay, so I guess my first starting point, I think, when it comes to talking about AI is really, it starts with the data. So having timely, complete, and consistent data in the first instance is the most important thing in order to empower this new generation of detection approaches, which are broadly categorized under the umbrella of AI. Underneath that AI, there's obviously multiple different types of machine learning. And the great thing about machine learning is you don't have to explicitly program a program to be specific about what it does. It can learn from the data by which it's provided, just for context in terms of definitions that we're all on the same page. You know, we thought deeply about this space, and if anyone's interested, Saf, maybe you might want to go look at it after. The team here, we published some research, really interesting research at CAMLS in Washington 2019. CAMLS is the Conference for Applied Machine Learning for Information Security, where all the people like us go to geek out on these sorts of things. But on the particular question is the problem that I essentially set the data science team was, listen, we want to detect things that we've never imagined before. To answer your question, you know, how do you detect things whereby we haven't been able to imagine in terms of ways of breaking into organizations yet? Now, there is a real world business problem, and I'm sorry to break this news to everyone on the webinar. People are weird. Technology is even like weirder sometimes. And so if we were just to tell people every time something was slightly anomalous, then we would be the most hated security company because the analysts would be using our name as a swear word. So the actual research that we did was, how do you then describe why something is anomalous and programmatically investigate it? And how we detect those like sort of unknown attacks, if you like, is we make no assumptions, or we make very little assumptions around the broad-based category of the data that we put into those algorithms that then outputs completely like pure data-driven anomaly detection. So hopefully that answers your question in terms of how we detect like previously unseen threats. And in terms of like how it's teaching itself to learn new things, in the same way that you've seen some great research come out of the likes of DeepMind and using adversarial networks, that's still very early days in terms of cyber. So we're definitely not there being able to teach itself just yet, but we will be, you know, and just looking at the way things move on. Hopefully that answers the question and hasn't been too boring for everyone else.
Cool. And finally, Karla, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so we're doing something that I personally find quite interesting on that with machine learning. So I don't think it would help you spot a black swan event, but we are using machine learning to predict which vulnerabilities will be exploited in the future. So, and we're not the only ones doing it. I know there's some other people trying to develop the same thing. So more of those, you know, threats that you know exist, but you don't know which ones are coming at you and which ones you really got to prioritize. So I think there are companies doing things like that to help make us a little bit more efficient.
Brilliant. Thanks. So just to quickly sum up, it'd be good to just kind of quickly sum up, Karla, if there's any other points, final points you'd like to make, or any kind of closing remarks.
I think one of the things we didn't cover that's very important to me is how, you know, how diversity makes a big impact in security. So particularly if we're thinking about our teams and recruiting, I think how you impact that and hire diverse teams is a really important takeaway.
Yeah, absolutely brilliant. And Dave, anything else? Any closing comments from yourself?
No, not at all. I think it's been a really good discussion, and you know, like I think we are faced with some significant challenges. You know, I feel like security people, you know what I mean, they just love to beat themselves up, you know, and so like in the face of all of these challenges, you know, I always like to end on a positive, and like, you know, the key thing is the people that are willing to like put themselves out there every single day to, you know, I think as Malcolm says, you know, we've got to get it right every single day. They've got to get it right once. And so please don't walk away from this super depressed as if this is just not going to get any better. Of course it will, but it all comes down to the great people we got in the industry to do it.
Cool. Fantastic. And Malcolm, any final comments from yourself?
Yeah, I often sit on as an attendee on calls like this, and I wonder I reflect on what have I got away from, what have I got out of this? And you know, I think the first thing that always gives me a level of yeah, that's 45 minutes well spent, is to understand it's not just me. There are other people who are facing exactly the same challenges, and that dialogue and discussion and engagement is absolutely what our adversaries are doing, and we've got to do exactly the same as well. So to follow on from this, it would be great if any of the attendees want to throw a LinkedIn invitation. More than happy to join and continue the dialogue, because that's that dialogue, that sharing of challenges, of solutions, of mitigations, and just tales of woe will make us that much more able to deal with the threat actor. And I finish as I started. Behind every single attack, there's a beating heart, and so understanding that is massively important.